Opportunities to share Divrei Torah, and recently I've been coming to the kollel once a week. Not long ago it was less than that, but the Rosh Kollel is really on top of me, and it's one of the highlights of my week, I must say, and I have great hanoah to come to the kollel and share Divrei Torah. So today we will not be giving another shiur, but rather some Divrei Chizuk and some Divrei Zekaron. Tomorrow is Tes Tammuz. Tes Tammuz is the yortzeit of Rebbe of the Klausenburg Rebbe. And I'm sure that throughout the years we mentioned and I shared some things that I learned from this giant of our time. The Rebbe, the Klausenburg Rebbe, was definitely one of the most outstanding monumental figures in the Torah world, in the Hasidic world, post-Holocaust. And it was Tofshin Nun Daled, 28 years ago, Beleil Shabbos Kodesh, She'olo B'Sara HaShomayma. And Chazal say, Gzer al HaMeshi Yishtakech Min HaLev, and Yud Beis Chodesh is this man of Avelis. But that is a day I will remember forever, and I could never forget. So many things that I shared and experienced and I learned from my great Rebbe that I'll never forget, but that Leil Shabbos Kodesh was so traumatic that it'll always be with me. After Suda Shabbos, and it was a quiet Leil Shabbos Kodesh like any other, and I think it was about 11 or 12 o'clock by night, and there was people running around in the streets and knocking on doors. Everybody should come to the Beis HaMedrash because there's a sudden decline. The Rebbe wasn't well for years before he passed away, and we all rushed to the Beis HaMedrash, and hundreds upon hundreds of people were saying Tehillim for an hour or so, and then an Einikel of the Rebbe stormed into the Beis HaMedrash and just banged on the bima, didn't say a word, couldn't say a word, and everybody knew what that means. And the Tehillim in one instant stopped, and was quiet, and instead of saying Tehillim, I think the hundreds of people standing there all started to cry. And 28 years have passed, and you probably see that I'm just remembering that Leil Shabbos Kodesh, and I am becoming emotional after 28 years. So I want to just tell you about the Klausenburg Rebbe because you're all young Avreichim, and none of you could have the opportunity to see this great tzaddik and this great gadol. I think the story of the Klausenburg Rebbe cannot be told without starting with the Shaya, with the period of the Holocaust and right after the Holocaust. But to me, the story of the Klausenburg Rebbe starts many years before that, because my late Shaver, my father-in-law, whose yortzeit was just a week ago, last week, and he was one of the only Talmidim that survived the Holocaust, Talmidim from Klausenburg. So today, in the entire Jewish world, when you say Klausenburg, what comes to mind is the Divrei Yatziv, the Klausenburg Rebbe. Historically, the Klausenburg Rebbe was the Rav of a tiny little Sephardic breakaway kehillah in Klausenburg. Klausenburg was a big, big Jewish center. It was a modern Jewish center, and the Klausenburger Rav, who was the real Klausenburger Rav, was a Rav Glasner, who was probably the only real Hasidic from a Zionistic Rav in the entirety of Hungary. He was a real Zionist, which was very, very, he was unique. So Klausenburg had two unique Rabbonim. Each of them was special in his own way. One was the only Zionistic from Rav in Hungary, and the other was the only one that in the Jewish world today is known as the Klausenburg Rav. It was a small Sephardi Hasidic community, and he had a small yeshiva, and only a few Talmidim survived, and one of them was my Shaver. My Shver actually, a few years was the Rav in Kiryat Sanz, when the Rebbe established Kiryat Sanz, and he was going back and forth from America to Netanya and back to America. He asked my Shver to be Rav of the community, which he was. And then when the Rebbe finally settled down in Kiryat Sanz, then my Shver became a Rav in Akko, and he was known in the Jewish and the Frum world as the Akko Rav. So my Shver many times told me how it was to be a Talmud of the Klausenburg Rebbe in Klausenburg. So it was a very small yeshiva, and it was very Hamish. And the Klausenburg Rebbe was like a father, and he told me they used to sleep in the Beis Medish. And so my Shver had a proper bed, and his Rebbe, the Klausenburg Rebbe, used to sleep on a bench, and the bench was next to the wall. And after a very few short hours of sleep, he used to either with his hand or his foot push against the wall, and the bench toppled over. And that is how we got up every day in the morning, with a big scream, Moida ani lefonecho, v'shagois v'koila koilas. And that is how I used to get up in the morning, just pushing against the wall and falling off that bench. And my Shver used to share with me experiences, how the shear was. So, to me, the story of my Rebbe starts years before the Shoah, years before the Holocaust, hearing stories that I heard from my Shver, who was one of the only surviving Talmidim from that Kufa. My father, as I told you many times, met the Klausenburg Rebbe second day Shavuos in Birkenau, in Auschwitz-Birkenau. My father and his family arrived the first day Shavuos, 1944. The Rebbe arrived the day later. The day my father arrived, his grandparents, father, mother, 5 out of 8 siblings went straight to the gas chambers and to the crematoria, and they went up in smoke. The day the Klausenburg Rebbe arrived, the day later, his wife and 10 children went straight to the gas chambers and to the crematoria, and he was left with his oldest son. His oldest son perished and died a few days after the liberation from illness, from typhus, and he was left all alone. And in the period of the Shoah, his tzidkus and his kedusha became so obvious. So to the Nazis, being a very important leader or a Rav gave you no special attention. It just made matters worse. They tortured the Rabbanim, they killed the leaders. And the Klausenburg Rebbe, in those terrible days, in those terrible circumstances, had no protection. Some of the young Jewish boys tried to help him, to make it easier for him, but to the Nazis, they were all the same. And the Klausenburg Rebbe worked Avodas Perach together with all the others, same. And when he used to work like a Eved Kanani, carrying heavy rocks and boards, and his lips were moving all the time, and he, as if was reciting some posek or speaking to himself. And one of the Jews came close to him and just listened to what he's saying, and he quoted the posek again and again and again. Tachas asher lo yavadeto es Hashem elokechu b'simcho u'b'toiv leivoiv meroiv koil. And that posek was Shogar al Shoinoi. And he just went over that posek again and again. Tziduk hadin, tachas asher lo yavadeto es Hashem elokechu b'simcho u'b'toiv leivoiv. The Rambam, as we know, quotes that posek at the end of Hilchos Lulav when the Rambam speaks about Simchas HaMitzvah. And that was Shogar al Shoinoi, Tziduk hadin, and say, well, we deserve this because we didn't serve the Kodesh Baruch Hu b'Simchas HaMitzvah. So this entire period, 14 months, that Hungarian Jews were in the Holocaust, he didn't eat cooked food, and he used to swap the soup, the awful soup that they got for another piece of bread or another raw potato, because he didn't want to eat, as much as one can, stay away from basar nevela. And he paskin to everyone, you need to eat whatever you have because it's pikuach nefesh, and it clearly was pikuach nefesh. So the heter to eat those macholas asuros were twofold or threefold. First of all, it was a clear pikuach nefesh. People died from starvation if they did eat, and if you would not eat, definitely would be a direct pikuach nefesh. And I think that food was nifsal, einay ra'ui leger, probably nifsal me'achilas kelev, and not only einay ra'ui leger. So there was so much room for kula, but as a great tzaddik, if Rebbe Kiva was Moise Nafsha and Erev and Chof Aleph, and he didn't want to drink the water, and he took it for the Tilis Yadayim. So the Klausenburg Rebbe and my father was together with him that entire period. They were a short while in Auschwitz. They were sent to Warsaw to part of a team to clear away the rubble after the uprising, and after the Warsaw Ghetto was destroyed. From there they went to Dachau and to Tutzing. And that entire period, that Rebbe Tzidkis was unbelievable, and he tried to not to eat macholas asuris at all. And after the war was over, and he lost his entire family, and the tragedy of losing his oldest son was a big ilui, chavavol of kibovas einoi, and he died after the liberation. And as the saying goes, the straw that broke the camel's back, that would be so devastating to see your oldest son surviving the war, and surviving all those horrors and torture, and passing away after it was all over from illness. And once in a very private conversation that I had with my great Rebbe, he said, not for one moment was I maharer achlei midosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I remember a shudder went through my body just to hear those words. Losing his wife and all 11 of his children, and being left all alone. And he said, "Kan ein rega v'chnish maharer gevein achlei midosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu." I never questioned the Kodesh Baruch Hu's ways, even for one moment. So in Perikei of Mesechet Avos, the Mishnah says, "Asora nisyonis niswa Kodesh Baruch Hu, niswa Avraham Avinu as Kodesh Baruch Hu. Asora nisyonis niswa Kodesh Baruch Hu, es Avraham Avinu v'omad bekulam." Rashi writes, "V'lo yihirer achrei midosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu." And probably what Rashi means to say is, there were many, many throughout the ages that were oimed b'nisyonis. Each and every one of us sometimes has nisyonis in life. Some more, some less. But maybe there were other Jews throughout the ages that were oimed in asara nisyonis. What was unique and special about Avraham Avinu was, Asara nisyonis niswa Kodesh Baruch Hu Avraham Avinu v'omed b'kulam. And that is exactly what I heard from my Rebbe. So going through all those horrors, and so many people were totally broken, and they left Yiddishkeit, and we have no right to judge them after what they've been through. So very recently, a month ago, I spent a few days in Munich, a conference of European rabbis, and I wasn't even aware that Fehrenwald is right next to Munich. And Fehrenwald was a DP camp after the war. A DP camp is a displaced persons camp. It was a German workers' camp, and the Americans kicked out all the Germans, and they gave the camp over to Jewish survivors. And Fehrenwald was where the Klausenburg Rebbe started rebuilding Yiddishkeit when the Holocaust was over. And I was in Munich, so I went to visit Fehrenwald. I just wanted to see the place where my parents met, my parents married, my older brother, whom I hope to see later tonight or tomorrow, chief rabbi in Montreal. He was born there in Fehrenwald. And they have a little museum there, and to me it was very moving just to see the place. So the Americans gave American names to the streets in Fehrenwald instead of the German names. So two little streets, New York Street and New Jersey Street, were where the Klausenburg was active. And most of the camp was totally secular. Most of the camp was totally non-frum. And we must try to understand there was a total breakdown of authority. Thousands upon thousands of young boys. No fathers, no mothers, no grandfathers. Everybody could do what he wanted. Just try to imagine. Oile Shiurim, it was after 4 or 5 years. No davening, no tefillin, no nothing, no kashrus. Even for Hungarian Jews. A year and a half with no siddur, no chumash, no gemara, no kosher food, no tzitzis, no tefillin, nothing. And suddenly you're free. No authority, no rabbonim, no parents, no zaydis, nothing. And after seeing so much nisyonis, each and every one of those boys, mea nisyonis, nisu HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Zaviseinu, the nisyonis they went through, seeing their fathers and mothers going up in ashes, in the smoke, and entire families. They had so many nisyonis. And there were very few like the Klausenburg Rebbe and like my parents who stuck to Yiddishkeit. And the Klausenburg Rebbe was almost a yochid, and I say this with all authority, almost a yochid that didn't waver for 1 second. 1 moment. He had no sveikas. The moment it was over, he dedicated all his might and all his energy to rebuild the Yiddishkeit. He was a very dominant personality, and he convinced the American authorities to give him a section of that camp, and that section was Kodesh V'Tohar. Nothing came in there. The Echod B'Iyah V'Shnayim Mishpocha stuck to the Klausenburg Rebbe, and those individuals became dozens, and they become hundreds, and that was probably the most significant rebuilding of Yiddishkeit in the direct aftermath of the Shoah. And in Fehrenwald, he built a school, and my mother was a student in that school, and then a teacher in that school, and yeshivas. And my father, from the very first day, as I mentioned before, the second day of Shavuos, when he approached the Klausenburg Rebbe, lo yisas yodoi mitoch yodoi. And after the liberation, because under the Nazis, there was nothing you could do besides just cling to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to your Yiddishkeit and your own. There was nothing you could do for others. But the moment it was over, the Klausenburg Rebbe told my father, now is the time to rebuild. And my father objected. He said, he was 17 and a half years old when he arrived in Auschwitz, and he was a big Ilya, and he said, I want to learn. And the Rebbe said, now is not time for learning. Now is the time for building. And the Rebbe told him, believe me, I want to learn as well. You think you're a Lamdan, I'm as much Lamdan as you are. And I would also like to learn. But now is not the time for learning. Now is the time for caring and for rebuilding and bringing Yiddish back. So my father volunteered for a few months. And there's a famous story in the Jewish world about my father and the Rebbe roving the area in an American army jeep and burying the dead, because Jewish dead were everywhere. And Dachau is not far from Fehrenwald. And Dachau was a camp. But it wasn't just caring for the dead, it was far more caring for the living. A cheder, a yeshiva, and mikveh. So actually the little museum in Fernwald is in the house that the mikveh was there. That was where they built the first mikveh, in those camps. So after a few months, my father told the Rebbe that he decided to go back to yeshiva, because the Rebbe opened the yeshiva. And the Rebbe told my father, Moshe, you know nothing about Mesiras Nefesh. Mesiras Nefesh is not depriving your body from food and drinks. That's Mesiras Guf, he said. Mesiras Nefesh is slamming your Gemara closed. That's Mesiras Nefesh. Closing your Gemara to care and to try to bring Kodesh Koch's Kinderlach back to Yiddishkeit. So after that Musa Shmuz, my father dedicated years, and he left Fernwald relatively late, 4 years after the liberation, when most of the people were already taken care of and married. Some had children, and most of them went off either to Yatziv or to America. That is when my parents backed up and left Germany. My oldest brother was born in Fernwald, and number two, my mother was 9 months pregnant, but she needed to lie because they wouldn't let her up on the plane. They would know how pregnant she is. And when I speak about my late mother, I think it was the only lie she ever said in her life. I don't think she ever lied again. She lied to the American authorities, and my second oldest brother was born a week after they came to America. So in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the Rebbe didn't dwell on his own loss, but dedicated all his koyach to rebuild Yiddishkeit. I think a year, the first Yortzeit or so, after the Rebbe passed away, I was invited to a big event of Agudas Yisrael in America. They asked me to speak about the Rebbe, and I told the story about Erev Yom Kippur Tavshin Vav, which was a year after the liberation. And the Klausenburg Rebbe, as one could expect, Erev Yom Kippur was a very special day, preparing for Yom HaKodesh V'Hanoira, and suddenly there's a knock at the door, and the Rebbe approaches, he opens the door, and a little girl is standing there. And the girl says, I remember every year my father used to bench me Erev Yom Kippur. But I no longer have a father. So she asked the Rebbe to bench her. He took a handkerchief, which is something that is no longer available, but it was since a few years ago. Let's say he took a napkin or a tissue, spread it over her head, because the tzaddik wouldn't touch a girl's head, and he put his hands on her head and he benched her. As we could expect, a few minutes later, there was another knock on the door, and another bunch of girls. So he spent half a day Erev Yom Kippur benching about 80 girls who were standing in line. Each of them lost a father. And this story is so symbolic because he was like a father to them all. So those remnants, as soon as Yeveshos, he gave them new life, a new spirit, a new hope, and a new neshama. And there are probably hundreds of thousands of Yidden today that owe their Yiddishkeit to that period. And the Rebbe was in charge of a few DP camps, Fernwald and Feldefin. There were two camps, two different sides of a river near Munich. And the Rebbe dedicated years just rebuilding Yiddishkeit. And just as an insight to his greatness. He was an enikel of the Divrei. And in many shiurim we shared throughout the years, I told you that the Klausenburg Rebbe, the Divrei was the Rashba, or the Rambam. He learned Divrei like I learned Rambam. And to him, every letter and every word in the Divrei was Kodesh Kodeshim. And the Divrei was very much against Shekel, as you probably know. And the Klausenburg Rebbe's family, a Shekel was like Chometz and Pesach. A Shekel by the Klausenburg Rebbe was almost like a machine matzah and Pesach. You must understand. But in Federwald, after the war, every girl that was willing to wear a Shekel, he gave the Shekel as a gift. That's just a bit of an insight into a real gadol. Understands different times. So there were very few girls that even considered wearing a shekel. So that was his personal gift. And a shekel cost a lot of money then. And nobody had anything. Nobody had money. So that was quite a challenge. So his personal gift to every chassid was, if the kal is willing to wear a shekel, that is his gift. I'm sure that he contemplated the lumdis and the sveikis and lifnei yevaloisitim, and it was till the because if he wouldn't give the shekel, there would be no shekel. So he was like a father to all those nevech, the kitzabrocha and nishomas that no longer had fathers and mothers. So these are stories I just heard. I wasn't around. So now I want to share with you what I personally experienced. And that was a different period in his life. I was born in America. And about 5 years after my parents came to America, the fourth out of 7 children. So the Klausenburg Rebbe was a leader of a Hasidic dynasty. Klausenburg Hasidim. Actually, it sounds. He saw himself as a mamshech of the Divrei. He was the 4th generation. The Divrei son was the Gorlitzerov, his son was the Rudenkerov, and his son was the Klausenburg. So the Klausenburg Rebbe was a great-grandson of the Divrei. And in so many ways, he was like the Divrei. The Divrei was a Hasidic Rebbe. But in the history of Hasidus, no other Hasidic Rebbe achieved the status of the Divrei as a Poisek Adol. Many other Hasidic Rebbeim were known to be tremendous Gedolim. Just to mention the Chidush, the Avnei Nezer, many others. But none of them really achieved the status as a Poisek Ador, like the Divrei. The Divrei was comparable in his generation to Reb Shlomo Kruger, to Reb Yosef Shon Natanzon, and most of the very serious questions, Shailas Halacha L'Maisa, came to the Divrei. The Avnei Nezer was known as a trailblazer, Derech HaLimud, and the Shiurim was known to be one of the greatest Charifim in his generation. But the Divrei was considered one of the greatest Gedolim of his time, and none of the Divrei children or grandchildren achieved that status till the Klausenburg Rebbe, who was also known as one of the greatest Gedolim of his time. And there are 7 volumes, Shalosh Yeshuvas Divrei Yatziv, which deal with the total spectrum of halachic discussion. But I think he was the only Rebbe in the history of Hasidus in 300 years, to the best of my knowledge, that by his Tish Friday night said a pilpul. The Divrei didn't have that minig. That was the Klausenburg Rebbe's minhag. And I think it's the only Hasidic Rebbe in 300 years since the Baal Shem Tov that set up Shekel in the Tish Friday night. And going back so many years, more than 50 years, you must understand in those days there weren't 5,000 Hasidim at the Tish. There were 25 Hasidim at the Tish. 30, It was a Shabbos Mavorchen. 50. And when he said the Pshetel 45, we're fast asleep. Didn't matter to him. My late father never was asleep. He was one of the only ones that followed the Pshetel, the Bilpum. But the Klausenburg Rebbe's personality, I don't care if everybody sleeps. You gotta do what you have to do. This is my meaning, and this is what I'm gonna do. He was treated for a heart illness in Mayo Clinic. His life was in jeopardy. On Friday night, he was in his room in Mayo Clinic with an old Gabba that I knew very well. I'm not going to mention his name because never in his life would he understand the Pshetel. So there were two people sitting next to his bed. And he made a tish and he said a Pshetel. Whom are you talking to? There's one Gabba that's fast asleep and the other one that left the room. And he started saying the Pshetel. Probably the Malachim were there. You know, Malachim came down Min HaShamayim to hear this tzaddik, what he has to say, his Pshetel. I don't think they intervened. They probably didn't interject, but that was the Klausenburg Rebbe. Every day was Mesiras Nefesh. You have to do what you have to do. Will other people come along? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And he was the Yid of Mesiras Nefesh. Friday night Batish, you say a Pshetel. And I don't care whether anybody is listening or not. This is what I do. So, and that was so symbolic of his combination of Kedusha and Chassidus and Torah. So that was unique. The Pshetel B'Leil Shabbos Kodesh. He was a Bali Yisurim. And maybe some of his Yisurim were associated with the Holocaust. But he was a Bali Yisurim. He was very weak. And he suffered from migraines all his life. And sometimes his headaches were just unbearable. For years he had a special thick rubber band that he put over his forehead and somewhat eased his pain. But he suffered from migraines, from headaches. And this is a story I told many, many times because I remember the impression it made on me. So once a week he gave a shiur klali to the entire yeshiva. But every day there was a private shiur in his room, in his private room, for a small group of talmidim. And for years I had the zchus to be part of that small group. And he used to give a shiur. And the shiur used to be anywhere between 50 minutes and an hour, which is relatively short. And we learned the Yeridea, we learned Choshen Mishpat, we learned Gemara, and usually he didn't really prepare that shiur. It was more spontaneous, more of the nature of a discussion, talking and learning. And I remember once the shiur was unusually short. It was about 40 minutes, and we didn't understand why. But after a few minutes, the mystery became clear. So a person whom I personally know, who was very close to the Klausenburg Rebbe, and he was a big Nogi, lived in London. And as the Rebbe finished the shiur, he walked into the room, and the Rebbe apologized, so we understood what happened. The Rebbe invited this person to come to see him Monday night, 8 o'clock or whatever it was. And he apologized that he can't because he needs to catch a 12 o'clock flight. And but Klausenburg Rebbe never knew what time it is. You know, he could plan something for 8 and it'll be 10. What could he do? Sometimes there was traffic in the middle of the Shemoneh Esrei. It took an hour to finish the Shemoneh Esrei. You know, you can't plan anything in advance. So this person apologized. He needs to catch a flight, and so it can be 8 o'clock. And the Rebbe said, "I promise. I know you need to catch a flight. Come at 8, and I'll be available." So the person comes at 8, and so the Gabbai tells him, "Okay, you'll need to wait." Say, "Well, I have an appointment at 8 o'clock." So the Gabbai was surprised, and he said, "But 10 to 8, the Rebbe started the shiur." "What do you mean 10 to 8 he started the shiur? How long would the shiur take?" He says, "An hour." So he says, but he knows I need to catch a flight. And she was very short. It took about till 8:30. And this person walks in and the Rebbe apologizes and he says, I did not forget my commitment. And I planned to see you at 8. But I had such a terrible headache and I took medicine, nothing helped. He said. He spoke, he expressed himself in a somewhat exaggerated way. That was his style. You know, Chazal we also find gizmos. So he said, I thought I'm going to die. He said, I had no other choice. I had no other option just to call into Bochum and learn. And this is something we actually saw and experienced. You know, it's usually a nice story. But there was something that we actually saw. When he learned, he was like transferred into a different realm. And he became young, and he became vital, and he became vibrant. And when he walked into the room to say the Shir, he was an old, weak man. Saying the Shir, he seemed to be 30 years younger and vibrant. And the moment he finished the Shir, he like imploded. So he apologized to this person and he said, I apologize, I did not forget what I promised, and I made the shorter Shir, but I had no choice. I had such a terrible headache that the only thing. So maybe some of you saw pictures of the Klausenburg. In most of the pictures, he's very serious. His image is one of Kovet Rosh. There are very few pictures in which he has an unbelievable, radiant smile. And one of the most beautiful pictures of the Klausenburg is an amazing, radiant, the smile of an angel, and his hand is like this, with a finger. And it's obvious that picture was made in the middle of a Shir. I don't know why we do this less today. And in Amolige Zeiten, Shivas and Megillah Shir use their fingers a lot. There's a beautiful picture of the Klausenburg with a radiant smile, and his hand is like this. When he learned Torah, it was Loi Ma'alma Udain. It was like a totally different experience. So there's a medrash in Parshas Yisrael, an amazing medrash. The medrash asks, the 40 days Moshe was in the heavens, what did he eat? Which is a strange question. What could he eat? But the Medrash asks, what did he eat? Well, the Pasuk says, Lechem lo yochel. Lechem lo yochel, Mayim lo yishoso. So, Menastam, Chazal Medayik, Lechem lo yochel. What, yes? And the Medrash says, Melachma shel Torah ochal. Umeziv hashchina. Melachmo shel Torah, umeziv hashchina. And I think Chazal don't say anything unless we have what to learn. And what we need to learn from this medrash is that a person could eat melachmo shel Torah, umeziv hashchina, and Dveikus and Torah could give you a livelihood, not only ba'olam haba, but and that gave him chiyus, it gave him strength. So in Shir Hashirim Perek Ches, the Pasuk says, Am yiten ish kol hoin beisoi boiz yevoizulo. And in Shir Hashirim Rabbo, the Medrash says, Kadom achrod Yochanan, when Rabbi Yochanan passed away, Koro achroi mitosoi, Em yiten ish kol hoin beisoi ba'av sha'av Rabbi Yochanan es ha-Torah boiz yevoizulo. And I once said, why do Chazal choose Dafka Rabbi Yochanan? Obviously, he was one of the greatest Ameroi. Rabbi Yochanan was the greatest of Ameroi Eretz Yisrael. We had Rav in Shmuel and Bavel, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish in Eretz Yisrael. And those were the first generation of the greatest Ameroi. But why do Chazal choose Dafka Rabbi Yochanan? So my feeling is in Brochas Daf Hey, the Gemara says Rabbi Yochanan carried with him a tooth or an etzem, Dain Groma da Asirui Biyo. And Rashi explains, and the other Rishonim on the spot, Rabbi Yochanan lost 10 children in his lifetime. All his children died al panav. So you could imagine what a broken man he was. And he carried with him different Perushim and Rishonim. Was it an etzem, which is unlikely because an etzem is mitama to masmeis, or maybe a tooth. V'hoyu menachem boi avelim. And he used to give chizuk to shvurei leiv, and he used to tell his personal tragedy. He lost 10 children. And the same Rebbe Yochanan in Bava Metzia Pei Dalet, when Rish Lakish passed away, he was shattered, he was heartbroken. And the Chachmei Beis HaMedrash said, he's not going to survive. So they looked for the biggest lamb, and they asked Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas to be his chavrusim. And they started learning together, and Rabbi Yochanan asked Kashas, and Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas, brings a Tana de Messiah Elei. And Rabbi Yochanan becomes frustrated. And he said, At Kabar Lekisha, Rish Lakish, everything I said, he had Kashas, and I had Terutzim. I don't need you to tell me how great I am. I don't need you to bring rayas to what I say. I want Rish Lakish's Kashas. B'shaf Medate. And the Chachamim davened that he pass away, and he passed away. So the same Rebbe Yochanan had lost 10 children, and he always found chizuk. But when he no longer had Rish Lakish as a chavrusa, Hatzari ein begilod, im roife ein sham. So it's no wonder that Achne Mitosa shel Rebbe Yochanan, they said, Im yite nish kol hein beisoi, v'yahava she'or Rebbe Yochanan is the Torah. And I think about my Rebbe's lifetime. So Rebbe Yochanan lost 10 children, the Klausenburg Rebbe lost 11. And his greatest love was Torah. Torah, learning Torah, teaching Torah, and building Torah. Every Thursday night he used to say Yeshir Chumash Rashi. And that was his platform for talking about Hashkofa, Shailish Azman Groma, current events. It was a Chumash Rashi Shir, but that was his major platform. And there's one Chumash Rashi that stands out, and I will remember it forever. So there was a person living in Kiryat Sanz. He was a Litvish person, no way a Chassid. But he admired the Rebbe like anybody that was exposed to the Klausenburg Rebbe. And once he came to visit the Rebbe with his 2 sons-in-law that learned the brisk, Litvish and Galai. And the Klausenburg Rebbe talked to them and learning, and he was very, very impressed. And he asked them where you learn. They said they learn in brisk. And how much do they pay every month? And you know how much they pay in brisk. So they said, a few cents. And he was so impressed. He so you learn Torah and Torah Chak. And Chumash Rashi, he really gave it to the Yungalite, to the Klausenburg Yungalite. And he said, I saw 2 Yungalite this week, Gevaldig Elamdonim, and they told me what they're getting paid, Koilo. And they learned with Mesiras Nefesh, Torah and Torah Chak. And he said, do you think I need your Streimlich? He said, your Streimlich mean nothing to me. Those Yugalite learned Torah and Torah Chak and Torah Yisurim. And that was a fiery Chumash Rashi. So let me make this clear. Streimlich meant a lot to him. He just said, Chassidish Levush was by him Yeher Gvar Yavam. None of his children have shirts with buttons, because a button is a modern thing. They have different type of shirts. Their kaftans don't have buttons; they have hooks. Who has a coat with hooks today? Maybe some ladies do. No, men do. So to him, the levush of his ovis meant a lot. But one line in Rashi, or one teretz in Tosfos, meant 1,000 times more than sh'tayim or a kaf. Imyitenish kol hoyin beisoy ba'ava she'oves ha'toyle boizi boizi lo. And I didn't even get to say a word about his tefillas, which were even more amazing than anything else. He was Amud Seloisen Yisrael. And our generation saw nothing like it. You know, I think he cried every Shemoneh in his life. I cannot recall the davening of Shemoneh in which he didn't cry. He used to talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Yiddish in the middle of davening. Even in the middle of Tfilas Amida. He used to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Tate Kroin was an expression he used a lot. I don't know, probably you heard it from his voice. Kroin is a crown. And he used to talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a tshuva in Imre Yosha. From time to time I quote the Imre Yosha. He was one of the greatest gedolim in the Litzia, Reb Meir Arik. And there's a tshuva, is a person allowed to talk in Yiddish in the middle of Shemoneh Esrei? Some say that tshuva was written to the Klausenburg. I don't know, there is no name there, but he says that Loi kol haroitz little as Hashem yovoi v'yitl, but if a person is really dovek and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he really means it, then it's not a hefsek. That's his psak. So there's a story told, it's like many other beautiful stories. In the rabbinical world of yore, especially in Hungary, when you came to visit a town, the first visit you made by the Moradas, and that was a Chok Baal Yahor. So the story goes that the Minchas Elazar was one of the Gedolim of that generation, the Munkat Sharav. He was also a Gadol B'Torah. Shabbos, Chuvas, Minchas Elazar, and he happened to be in Klausenburg, so he wanted to come visit the Klausenburg. And to Hasidim, the Klausenburg was the Klausenburg. The Munkat Sharav would never set foot into the home of Rav Glasner, because he was a Zionist, and the Minchas Elazar was, as you probably know, not much of a Zionist. So he sent his Gabbai to the Klausenburg to check whether he could come visit. And the Gabbai comes back and he says he's in the middle of davening. And the Minchas Elazar tells him, check where he is in the middle of davening. Where? The Gabbai comes back and he says, Vayavorech David. And he tells him, Shoita, Vayavorech or David? I told you to check where he is. Check whether he's Vayavorech or David. So that's the story. And that's the way he davened. And the shachas could sometimes take 2 hours or more. Mincha could take 25 minutes. And kebena meschata b'fnei Yovel, like Chazal described Rebbe Kiva in Brochas Daf Lamed Aleph, and Nichoy Hoda b'Zovi Zeh v'Motzoi b'Zovi Acheres. So that was my Rebbe, who I had the schus of being shamish, of seeing, and being the Talmud of a great tzaddik is not only a privilege, it's also a responsibility. And that is a story I heard many, many times from the Klausenburg Rebbe. He used to say one of his earliest memories is sitting in his father's lap, and his father was the Ridnik Rav, and his father was crying, and I asked my father, Tata, why are you crying? So he said, Ich bin dich mekana, I'm mekana you. And I was puzzled, and I said, Tata, you're a big Rebbe, you have a lot of Hasidim, I'm a little boy, why do you have to be mekana me? I'm mekana you. So he said, I'm mekana you because you never saw the Divrei and I did. And I didn't understand, and I once again asked my father, it's another reason I should envy you, because you had the schus of seeing the Tzanza Zaida, the Divrei. And my father told me, you're going to come up with Beis and Shalmala, what could they demand from you? I mean, you didn't see the Divrei. So, but when I'm going to come up there, they're going to tell me, you knew the Divrei. So exactly what did you learn from it? I mean, you had the privilege of seeing the Divrei, and this is who you are. So my father was crying, and he used to relate that story many times. So many times I asked myself, you knew the Klausenburg Rav, so that's a tviyah. That's a tviyah. You know, it's so it's not only a privilege, it's a responsibility as well. So Baruch Hashem, I had the schus of being mishamish Adam Gadol, and I hope that some of the things I saw and experienced made an impression on me. So schusay tov and oleinu, kol Yisrael, tomorrow is the Yortzeit, and he should be a Meretz Yeshur for his Talmidim, Talmida. I once came to visit him in his elderly years, and that was after he built the Laniado Hospital and Mifal Hashas, and so many amazing projects. And he said, "Ze chelki makol amori, ze chob talmidim marbitzei Torah. Ze chelki makol amori, that I have talmidim that are marbitzei Torah." That is another reflection of his unbelievable Ahavas Torah. So we try to be Marbitz Torah Yisrael, and he should be a Meretz Yeshur for his Talmidim and Talmidei Talmidav, or my Talmidim in a way, are part of his Harbotzes Torah, and we should be Zoichet to B'Seres Toivus and Yeshuas and Nechomes and Bias and Mashiach Tzedkeinu B'Meiru B'Yomeinu B'Yomeinu.